Great. So welcome everybody to today's webinar on pay inequity in Atlantic Canada. I'd like to start off with the land acknowledgement. Across Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and parts of New Brunswick, we are in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq for at least 12,000 years. And parts of southern New Brunswick, Wolastoqey, and Beskadu Muhadi peoples have inhabited Wolastoqey territory for 8,000 years. Newfoundland is on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Beothuk, and Labrador is on the ancestral homelands of the Innu, Nanatsina, uh, Nanatsia, Inuit of Nanatsivut, and the Inuit of Nanakwut across Labrador. Sorry if I've not pronounced those words correctly, but if you have any land acknowledgements that you would like to tell us about, you can put them in the chat. We would also like to acknowledge that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 4,000 years. So today's webinar is a community discussion where we'll talk about the newest CCPA Nova Scotia report's findings on pay inequity, and we have special guests to discuss the status of pay equity in the Atlantic provinces. I would like to introduce our first presenter, who is Christine Saunier, Director of CCPA Nova Scotia. Christine is here in Chibouctouc, Halifax, and she'll present the findings on pay gaps in the 4 Atlantic provinces.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Really appreciate that. Great. Thanks, Ruby, for sharing. Welcome, everyone. I want to start by saying I may be presenting the findings, but I want to thank very much Daniel Soda Sandi, who's in the seminar with us. He was critical to this report as our main analyst and data guru. I thank him very much for all of the work he did on this report with me. It was a great collaborative report, and I thank all the collaborators who have come forward from the Atlantic provinces to discuss a really critical issue, pay inequity in Atlantic Canada. I've had the privilege to do some media over the last, I'm still doing some media, so good that we can still get public attention on this really important issue. And so what I'm going to do is just try very briefly to give you an overview, and we'll put the link of the report in the chat. It's also available in French, so you can download that. We also have fact sheets for each of the provinces, and the report is 60 pages. There's lots of data in there, so I will just give you a sense of sort of the trends across how the Atlantic provinces compare, and what are the key takeaways from the report. The first slide, Ruby, the next slide. So this isn't actually in the report, and we probably should have put one, but we kept pulling data. I kept asking Danielle to pull one more data set, and this one totally slipped my mind and is a really important one. And it's a question that I've been asked by media and asked Danielle to quickly pull. So I'm sharing it with you because I think we should start here and say, look at that. Those pay gaps have come down. They have come down. They still exist, but I think we can mostly celebrate that, especially in the maritime provinces, the gap has come down and was, well, look at PEI from 25% in 1997 down to 5. We have, is that, I can't tell, that is Nova Scotia. 32 to 14, 33 to 15. No, that's Nova Scotia, then New Brunswick. And Newfoundland and Labrador, the story there is, of course, some of the volatility in natural resource sector really is impacting, and you can see that volatility in this pay gap. And so there has been a decrease, and that's not something to not celebrate. but there is definitely more work to do in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I did want to start there, and I say mostly because there are two ways to address the pay gap. One is to lift up women's wages, and the other is to see men's wages decline. And we have seen that with some declining in some manufacturing jobs and some jobs where we had seen men wages decline. So it is mostly a success story with some women entering into senior professions and some shifting of occupations, and all of that is happening. And I think it's good to start there and be reminded that things were worse and we have to keep going. Next slide. So when we started to discuss doing this work, we actually had planned to do an event on Equal Pay Day. So Danielle's first task was to figure out what Equal Pay Day would be. So that is the symbolic day in this year, in 2026, which marks the work day in which women will have earned the same amount. So, how many extra days do women have to work in 2026 to equal a men's annual salary in 2025? And when we did that work and saw that Newfoundland Labrador was June 12th, we planned on June 12th. We were delayed a little bit, but here we are. Newfoundland and Labrador women just passed their Equal Pay Day, June 12th. That is a sad, sad symbolic day when you think it's almost 6 months into the year, and when it's 116 work days, and when that gap represents $355 per week on average. That compounds week over week, year over year, over a career. That's having a detrimental impact on women in Newfoundland and Labrador. Nova Scotia's is was April 1st, which I think is interesting for lots of reasons. We're not going to talk about April Fools, but more that that's when the minimum wage goes up in Nova Scotia every year, and it's always on my radar. And I think, well, isn't that interesting that that is also Nova Scotia's Equal Pay Day? And New Brunswick's is not far behind. Our pay gap is very similar, March 28th. And PEI, with the smallest gap in the country, still looking at working 20 extra work days, and their Equal Pay Day is January 28th. And at $59 a week, again, adds up over the years. And this is, of course, average weekly wages. This is not what this might look like over the annual. And one of the things that we talk about in the report is why it's so important when governments are looking at addressing pay equity, and when we're looking at what is happening on the pay equity front, is that we look at all of the data that we can find, and we tried to put a lot of that in the report, but that we don't just look at hourly. I was looking at, for example, British Columbia does an annual reporting on pay equity, and they focus on hourly. And if you focus on hourly, you're likely to see much smaller pay gaps. Um, but before I go there, why don't we actually show you what this looks like in terms of how we compare to the other provinces in Canada? The next slide, Ruby. So these are all the provinces in Canada, and you see PEI there at the lowest, and New Brunswick second lowest, Nova Scotia third, and then Newfoundland and Labrador second highest pay gap in the country, just a little bit less than Alberta. Instructive to see where the Canadian median is at 20%. So still lots of work to do across the country. And then the next slide does show you the difference. So that was your weekly. This is your hourly. And if you really just only look at hourly, hourly is not capturing hours worked. It's not capturing any fluctuations of hours worked, whether that's women working fewer hours or men actually working overtime. It's also not capturing over the year whether, and it's often women who are still predominantly doing caregiving responsibilities that are taking some leave, so unpaid leave throughout the year, as well as we are seeing still that in terms of percentage of workers who are working part-time, more women than men are working part-time. So this hourly is important, and we should continue to talk about why the minimum wage hourly is too low, and we certainly present our living wage work in terms of hourly, but why it's so critical that we also look at annual income, which is, but before we go, I mean, we should say PEI does not have a pay gap when you look at hourly. Actually, PEI women earn more than men if you only look at hourly, and that is something to celebrate. However, let's look again, but let's look forward at the annual income. The next slide. So that we don't have annual income for 2025. So just noting that this is actually 2024. But annual income captures all those fluctuations. And look where PEI lands, right? That is still a very significant gap looking at annual income because it captures those fluctuations. But New Brunswick and Nova Scotia still are the same. Quebec and Nova Scotia are tied there, but second, third. So in terms of ranking, these are bigger gaps when you look at annual income, but in terms of ranking, we are similar. Now, that's not true for Newfoundland and Labrador. There are two provinces that have deeper pay gaps looking at annual income. So Newfoundland and Labrador's doesn't fluctuate as much as some of the other provinces. Next slide. Um, and our report, what we tried to do was show both where we're seeing smaller pay gaps, so what industries, what occupations and sectors, and also where are we seeing larger gaps. And I really do suggest that you look at the report, which gives you the full data on this. I am going to flag one of the things that we talked about in our recommendations is the lack of disaggregated data. This is Census 2021. So we are waiting for the next round of census data because we don't have this kind of disaggregated data by province in Atlantic Canada. We have quite small numbers when it comes to racialized, Indigenous, and non-permanent resident or even immigrant women. So the labor force survey, which is the regular data that comes out on the labor force, which does now present racialized data on a regular basis, shows only Atlantic Canada, does not break out by province, and it does not break out in these other ways. So this is the most current data, which is sad reflection. Now, I don't anticipate that this trend has changed very much over the last 5 years, that we likely still see much higher wage gaps for racialized women, for Indigenous women, and in particular, and you can look at the data in the report, we do look at immigrant women who are permanent residents, immigrant men, and we look at actually Indigenous men and racialized men as well. And it's true that there are gaps for men comparing men to men, but the women have a much, much larger gap. So you can look at that data, and some of these gaps are very significant. The non-permanent resident gap for women is just outrageously big. So these would be work permit, any international students, anybody on non-permanent residency status. So that's a big red flag as we look at these issues. Now, in terms of industry and occupation, I will dig in a little bit, but you do need to read through to see what some of this means. So there are pay gaps in almost all industries and occupations. Interesting that we in Newfoundland, Labrador, and PEI are not seeing a gap in occupations, art, culture, recreation, sport. That is a pretty large occupation classification. And one of the things that has been flagged about this area is there's a good portion of these jobs, and that may vary by province, that are quote unquote public sector jobs, right? At public community centers, that kind of thing. And so that is impacting those wages there because you'll see why the public sector is so important. But you can clearly see in Newfoundland and Labrador the huge pay gap there for manufacturing and utilities. Very significant pay gap in trade, transport, equipment. And if you were to look at, and we have more graphs in the report that show the concentration of women and where we find predominantly women occupations versus predominantly male. Those two that I just mentioned are still predominantly male, though we are seeing percentages of 20 and 30% of women, even in those professions, and still seeing these very, very significant gaps. Even in health occupations where it's over 80% of women, we are still continuing to see pay gaps. They are much, much smaller. PEI still it's 7 cents. So, they still exist there. And some of what you would see if you look at the other data in the report is that we're still having the glass ceiling, so women are still not occupying as many senior managerial positions as men, and that's happening even in the professions where women are predominantly occupying those positions. So that glass escalator for men and the glass ceiling for women is a thing that you can actually see in the data. Um, uh, Actually, Ruby, go back one more time. Sorry. The other thing about looking at industry and occupation is that it's not just that we're looking at. So where there's concentration of women, we do see smaller gap. Where there's concentration of men, there is bigger gaps. We could do it by manufacturing, service versus service industry. I mean, goods producing, manufacturing, and service. But we could also look at it in terms of pay. And women are still concentrated in the lower paid positions. So sales and service is we still see a high concentration of women in those occupations too. So even though health occupations, it's not as low, there's certainly a range of differences in terms of what kinds of jobs women are occupying in these areas. And so when you look at some of these, like occupations, education, law, and social, you do see the differences in where women are occupying different positions. So sometimes they're in, say, trades, transport, and equipment, even though we might have higher numbers there, we may be occupying lower paid admin positions, as an example. So more of that data is in the report to explain how this is impacting the either narrowing or making the pay gap larger. Okay, Ruby, next. We were trying to think through the things that women have been told to do, right, to address this. Go get some education. Well, women have done that in droves. And you do see that even for women who have a bachelor's degree or higher, you are still seeing a pay gap there from 3% in PEI to 9 in New Brunswick, 14 in Nova Scotia, and 10 in Newfoundland and Labrador. But boy, those gaps are huge for comparing women and men who have less than a high school. So, certainly the bachelor and getting more education, you can see the gap going down for the most part. New Brunswick, you see a little bit. So high school graduation definitely helps. Post-secondary below bachelor's, not as much as bachelor's degree or higher. So investing in education certainly is something that should be on the agenda, and making that obviously more accessible and affordable, if not free. Yes. Next slide. So the areas where we see smaller gaps, unionized jobs. The union, if you are in a unionized job, it makes a big difference, and we can all think through in a common sense way why that matters. There is more pay transparency, right? You have a collective agreement, you have a pay grid. It isn't mostly on the individual woman's shoulder to come in and negotiate that very first salary. And lots of other reasons why the grievance procedure, the clearer promotion and opportunities, and all of that comes from having a collective agreement and having collective bargaining and having a collective body that has your back. Clear differences between unionized and non-unionized workers with much more significant gaps. Even so, there's PEI. Actually, unionized workers in PEI have no pay gap. And the pay gap for non-unionized workers is 17%. So that's very significant. Now, what we will flag on the next slide is that part of the explanation is the public sector. So a lot of our public sector jobs, certainly the very narrow public sector government direct service, would mostly be unionized in all of these provinces. And in fact, we know that PEI's public sector takes up a larger share of the economy in PEI, which is part of the explanation of why we see a smaller gap in PEI. Other things that we noticed because we were looking at PEI a little more closely was that there's a larger share of public administration positions in PEI, and women occupy more of a share of those. And actually, women work a little bit less on the part-time front on PEI. So all of that is interesting to note for PEI. But here you can see the difference between the private and public sector, and why it's so critical that our pay equity legislation is applied to the private sector. Look at those gaps. There is no reason. And we did want to flag, right? Like, it's not everybody that has access to a union job. And the coverage rates, we've been at these levels for a very long time if we were to show you the trends. And actually, this is an example where men have actually lost some of their unionized positions and women have gained, and in some instances, have more access to collective coverage than men. So the coverage rates matter, and where the jobs are, again, public versus private, you see the differences. Higher unionization rates in the in the public sector than the private sector. So all of that matters too. And I think that was it for me throwing some data at you to give you some findings. And we have time for discussion after. We're going to have provincial partners go now, and then we will have discussion. So hold your questions or put them in the chat now, and we'll deal with them after. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you, Christine. I was glad to see that there were smaller gaps in the unionized jobs. But we have a lot of work to do. So our next presenter is Joanne Perrin. Joanne is the Executive Director for New Brunswick Pay Equity Coalition, and Joanne is joining us from Moncton, New Brunswick. So welcome, Joanne.
Thank you.
So Joanne, you've been doing advocacy in this area for 20 years. And I know you just had a significant milestone in New Brunswick. So can you share that with us? And any key lessons you have learned from the work you have done?
Well, it's not making me any younger, but it's been even 25 years. So, but first of all, I also want to thank CCPA for doing this research. I think it's really useful data, and it's making anger go up, and it helps us maybe to advocate for better conditions for women in the workplace. So yes, we've had a major gain recently with pay transparency. We've been advocating for pay transparency for a few years, and now the government has passed pay transparency legislation, and that's particularly important so that workers who are part of equity-seeking groups, whether it's women or Indigenous women, racialized women, people with disability, like having access to wage information is often key to negotiating better wages. So that's what pay transparency will do. It will ensure that employers will give information about the wages they're offering in job postings. It will also forbid them from asking past history from employees or candidates that they want to hire, so that if you have experienced inequity before, it's not going to follow you throughout your career. The last part has not been proclaimed yet. It's in the act, but it's not proclaimed yet. It will forbid employers from asking employees to keep their wages secret. So it means that employees will have the ability now to share information about their wages with their colleagues. If you don't have that information, how can you even tell you have equal pay for equal work, right? So that's those are the key points. But another important aspect is reporting. Employers will have to report on gaps that they encounter in their workplace. However, we are still waiting for regulations to see how this will unfold, as well as what will be the compliance mechanisms. So the fight is not over. It's a nice win, but we are looking forward to the next steps. And we are told it's not going to take forever. It should be in the next year, but we are hoping that will move as fast as possible. And the other win that is, well, a win on the horizon, I should say, is that the current government has promised pay equity legislation. So that means that employers would have to compare jobs that are mostly done by women with jobs that are mostly done by men in the same workplace. And if the wage is not equal for jobs that have the same value, the employers will have to correct that. So that's a major step forward. We are told it's going to happen in 2027. We keep an eye for it. That's something we're hoping that we'll be able to report on next. And I should be more specific. We have pay equity legislation for the public sector, but we don't have it for the private sector. So that also contributes to the fact that the wage gaps are smaller in the public sector, right? So that's an important move forward for the private sector to have that pay equity legislation. Like we often say, pay transparency highlights the gaps, but it doesn't correct it. You need the pay equity legislation to go further and really help close the gaps. So key lessons now. Well, after 25 years, I can certainly testify to the fact that those wins don't come easily, and that progress really is comes from sustained pressure over time. I think all those who are here know about that, but it's always a good thing to remind ourselves. We're talking about systemic change, big cultural change, and that's not going to happen overnight. We're building. Well, we're trying to correct discrimination that's been there for centuries, really. So we can't hope that one single action will do it. You know, one march is not going to correct anything. We have to remind ourselves. But at the same time, all those marches are important. So all those little steps are what builds a movement, and that's the way we can get where we want. I also want to mention the fact that because you need so many steps and you need so many people all over the place to participate when you want to make that kind of change, you have to find your allies everywhere. That's what we found. We have allies among workers, women, men, among unions, among nonprofit organizations, and even among civil servants, elected officials, all political parties. It's never it's never just one group. Feminists, university, academia. So all of this is important. Funders, in our case, we are lucky to get funding from the federal government that supports our work, and we also have an annual fundraising campaign. So all those allies around us make this work happen. And it's often just a couple of people that people see, right? I'm often seen as the face of the coalition, but a coalition is that, a coalition, a group of people who work together in the same direction. So that's what I would want to bring forward. And also, one thing I learned from the Pay Equity Act 2009, the one for the public sector, is that it's not going to be over with just legislation. You need to be there at every step after as well. And I find that's hard because we're tired by the time we get to that line and we feel it's the finish line, but it's not. It's not. And that's probably going to be the coalition's next challenge to remind ourselves when and if and when we get our legislation for pay equity for the private sector, it's not over. So that's the message I'd like to leave. It's a process. So it's a long-term program in the end.
Joanne, thank you. It is a process, but it's a process worth fighting for. And congratulations to you and New Brunswick on the pay transparency. Congratulations. We need that in Nova Scotia. Hopefully, at some point, maybe
Mm.
next year, we'll be able to say that we have it. Next, we have Bridget Clark, and Bridget is the advocacy coordinator at St. John's Status of Women's Council. And Bridget is joining us from, I think it's Point Saunders, I believe. So, Bridget, can you share some similarity? What is happening in Newfoundland and Labrador when it comes to pay equity?
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I am based out of St. John's in my work day to day and in my life. However, today I am joining this conversation from the community of Port Saunders on the Great Northern Peninsula, which is Uktamguk, the island of Newfoundland within the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So I'm glad to situate myself and to be here together, particularly in conversation with peers and friends and allies across Atlantic Canada. It's really great to be here. So Newfoundland and Labrador has kind of a winding history with pay equity specifically, and I think that that work has accelerated a lot over the last several years. But I kind of want to paint a bit of a timeline, if you will, to kind of lead us to how we got to where we are. So in 1988, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador negotiated a pay equity agreement for healthcare workers with NAPE. And that was really considered kind of a watershed moment at the time, which, of course, happened through lots of work with labor organizers, feminists, and I think was also building on momentum that was happening across Canada as well in lots of ways. Fast forward to 2017, and also I want to recognize between 1988 and 2017, there was lots of work going on as well. But on International Women's Day in 2017, a motion to introduce pay equity legislation by Jerry Rogers was unanimously passed in the House of Assembly, which was very exciting and an important moment at the time. In 2018, the government introduced an interdepartmental committee on pay equity. And it's important to note here that this committee did not meet between 2018 and 2021. Those were kind of stagnant years following that motion being passed. So cut to 2022, when the St. John's Status of Women Council launched an advocacy campaign in the summer to support the proactive pay equity and pay transparency legislation. And specifically, this was really to kind of recognize the gap between the past motion and the lack of follow-up. And we did this work and produced a report with the Provincial Action Network on the Status of Women, which is the collective of Status of Women councils across Newfoundland and Labrador, the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor, who have been real leaders in this work, and the Workers' Action Network, which was a really important grassroots active group at the time. And just a couple of months later, in October of 2022, the sitting government passed Bill 3, which is an act respecting pay equity for the public sector and pay transparency for the public and private sector. And while this was, of course, welcomed in many ways and really felt exciting at the time, it's important to kind of talk through the nuance of that a little bit more, the act moved through provincial legislature at a breakneck speed, and there was almost no time for public debate or consultation in those few weeks, really. In 2023, consultation processes started to unfold, but this was specifically on the regulations of that legislation. And there's a What We Heard report from that consultation process that was released at the end of 2024, but specific regulations have really yet to be announced and made available. So I want to talk a little bit more about the legislation itself. To date, the way the legislation is practically quite weak. As it's written, most of it has come into effect yet. Most workers across the province are not actually protected by the current legislation. It only applies to a very small section of the public sector. There are, as I said, still no regulations or timeline introduced to enact pay transparency for both public and private sector. Most importantly, like I said, the private sector is left out of the pay equity part of the legislation altogether. If you look at the kind of language of the act itself, pay equity and pay transparency is not enshrined as fundamental human rights, which we know it is. And also importantly, the legislation really lacks mechanisms for oversight and enforcement. And this is a critical part, as you mentioned, Joanne. As the report from the CCPANS lays out, there's lots of different ways at measuring the wage gap, but no matter how it's calculated, the gap exists and is consistently wider, as you've said, and as the data really clearly illustrates, the gap is wider, particularly for women of color, people of color, those who are Black and Indigenous, who are 2S LGBTQIA+, and who have disabilities. And I know you said that in recognizing Equal Pay Day, you were a bit delayed in terms of your goal of June 12th. And although my math is not reliable, I think it's actually quite fitting that we're towards the end of the month, because that's probably closer for recognizing how many days, particularly for women of color, Indigenous women in Newfoundland and Labrador especially. I also want to talk a little bit more about something that many of us probably know lots about, but it was referenced in the What We Heard report from the consultation process that I referenced that was released in 2024, which is the Canadian Human Rights Act. It was referenced as kind of a catch-all. So we know that this is the way that the legislation is written. However, don't worry, the Canadian Human Rights Act covers all of us. And while it's true that all workers in Canada have human rights legislation that restricts employment discrimination generally, pay inequity specifically, the act is really wide-reaching, but it is a complaints-based process, which maybe folks know already, but maybe not. So what this means is that the onus falls on individual workers to identify and then fight for pay equity within their workplaces by filing a human rights complaint. And importantly, often people don't even know what they're being paid, if it's fair or consistent for work of equal value, especially without that pay transparency legislation, which has already been spoken about too. So really that's kind of what's going on. That helps to paint the picture, particularly with the wide gaps. There are a lot of factors. I also want to talk about kind of some of the discourse. So while there's been a lot of real groundswell of advocacy and action in support of pay equity and transparency in Newfoundland and Labrador, especially over the last several years, as I've said, some of the local discourse has been that while proactive pay equity legislation is passed, it might not actually do enough or reach enough people for it to be worthwhile. And that's kind of been sometimes within that discourse. And this is something that we really wholeheartedly reject as a narrative. One important part of this analysis is that while pay equity and pay transparency legislation is foundational to closing the wage gap, legislation is only as good as it's written and as good as it's implemented and as good as it's enforced. So at face value, it's not enough to say that pay equity legislation isn't impactful in our province because, as we've said, we still have the highest wage gap in Atlantic Canada and the second highest across the country. Because as it stands, our current legislation just truly lacks the language, the scope, and the oversight to create widespread meaningful change and to rectify pay inequity across all industries where it exists. So that's where we are. And we have been very lucky to kind of work together with peers, especially, as I said, in Atlantic Canada. But also, as Christine, you said so clearly, there's so much work left to do. And that's where we are right now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, truly, there is a lot of work to do, and I liked what you said about the Human Rights Act. It's a complaint based, and that's the thing. A lot of folks don't get out and make those complaints like they should. So, Bridget, thank you so much. Next, we have Vanessa Bradley, and Vanessa is the executive director of the PEI Advisory Council on the Status of Women. Vanessa is joining us from Charlottetown, PEI. Hello, Vanessa. Um,
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
can you share the role of the Advocacy Council on the issues and where things stand on PEI when it comes to advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started as executive director of the PI Advisory Council in January of this year, so I'm fairly new to the position. And the Advisory Council, we are an arm's length government agency and we advise government on gender equality. So that covers a lot of different things. We do several events. We also sit on many committees. And government consultations. And the most recent project that we've completed related to pay equity is our equality report card. And so that was launched in May of this year. The report card grades government on how they're doing in relation to gender equality across a series of categories. And so in the 2026 equality report card, government earned 73 out of 100 points. The report card focuses on several categories like diversity, equity, inclusion, eliminating poverty, caregiving, mental and physical health, and ending gender-based violence. And that is available on our website if anyone cares to take a look. So currently, the Interministerial Women's Secretariat is doing a statistical profile of women in PEI. They've promised that that will be out this year. So we're very much looking forward to seeing those statistics and how that relates to pay equity. So that's something that the Advisory Council is looking forward to seeing. It's been several years since the last one. A bit of a struggle with PI is we're small, so we often don't hit the register on national statistics. So reports like this Closing the Gap is incredibly important, as well as that statistical profile or any kind of research that we can do here on PEI. We have a high percent of women in civil service. And so that definitely affects, I mean, everything affects data, as we know, but that certainly affects the data. There are a lot of benefits. The pay is better, there's flexibility, and the gender pay gap is much smaller there. However, we're still not reaching gender parity in leadership positions, and certainly not in the legislature. So there's a lot of work to be done there as well. And another important factor about PI is that PI has a lot of seasonal work and we are very tourism based. And I think that that's a really essential piece to keep in mind as we look at the report. Like many families, many households, many communities run on women who have these civil servant jobs. At the council, we know that in many households, the women of the household have the year-round, well-paid position with benefits, and their partners often have the seasonal positions in fishing, farming, tourism, and construction. And so that certainly makes a difference. I think that it's incredible to see that PEI has a 5% wage gap. Like if you look at it, it looks, oh my God, that's amazing. We're doing so well. And in many ways, sure. And in many ways, there's also a lot to be done. The advocacy landscape is very strong in PEI, and reports like this one really do deserve attention and are essential to progressing toward gender equality because the report, as Christine was saying, is long and shows so many different statistics and so many different ways to look at the data so we can get a more fulsome picture. And some things are certainly working and contributing to the lower wage gap in PEI, like the $10 a day childcare initiative. That's huge for caregivers. And that's a really important piece that government has actually kept up with. And our average earnings in PEI do tend to look pretty good. And in a lot of ways, that's because we have a lot of high earners and a lot of low income earners. And so it's one of those things where it averages out to be like, oh, that looks great. But when you dig into it, it's like, is it really great? And how great is it? And noting that PEI, like other provinces, those gaps between racialized women and non-racialized men, this large gap is, as we've discussed already, concerning and tells us what we already know to be true, which is that discrimination and marginalization greatly affects women's earnings. And the residency status, that plays a huge piece in PEI. The wage gap for non-permanent resident women, I think, was 54%. and that's huge. And the diversity of PI has also shifted a lot in the last 20 years. And so the province is still grappling with how to integrate immigrants and newcomers into PEI communities. And it's something that a lot of work needs to be done toward. And I think that work toward that will ultimately help with when it comes to pay equity. And this is something that we've seen at the council time and time again. We hear from women who are newcomers and immigrants who feel the repercussions of this pay gap in their everyday lives. We've had council members have to resign because the council takes up time that they need for paid work. These women want to be a part of the council and they want to contribute to equality. But the demands on women who are newcomers and immigrants and caregivers are high and often nearly unmanageable, which pushes folks more and more toward burnout. And I also think that when we're looking at those high pay gaps, in a small place like PEI, who you know really matters. And I'm sure other folks can also understand this. I think this plays a huge role in the gender pay gap that we see with racialized women and women without permanent status. It is much harder to get a well-paying job when you're competing with someone already well-known in community or someone who can easily get a good reference. And so that who you know really does play out, I think, in relation to things like pay equity and that gap that we're seeing. And in addition, there's also the fact that employers take advantage of low-income women and of temporary workers who come in under the temporary foreign worker stream, which is a big thing in PEI. The council focuses a lot on migrant workers' rights. And there are a lot of women in the stream who are taken advantage of by their employers, and they don't have the support or the skills to advocate for themselves. So there's a lot of things that contribute to this. And I think that PEI, while we are in theory in a great place, I think that there's a lot that needs to be done within the landscape of pay equity and a lot of more upstream solutions that can be worked on that would ultimately also help with some of the pay equity disparities that we're seeing, for lack of a better word. And the caregiving piece is also extremely important, and that's something that the council has focused a lot on. Caregivers are invaluable to social, emotional, and economic well-being, and we all know that women continue to shoulder the majority of this burden, and benefits that are offered are well below what's required for basic needs. So strengthening employment standards, increasing paid sick leave provisions, and better supporting caregivers to fully engage in the labor market is something that we believe requires maximum attention and support from our government. And I thought it was interesting because that Christina's saying that statistically there are less part-time women workers on PEI. And part-time work is often what's feasible for women who have large caregiving responsibilities. And yeah, I'm interested to see how that data continues to shake out. So yeah, I think that's it from me and PI. Happy to answer any questions. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I have all kinds of questions, but I think I'll wait till the question and answer session. So, or period. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. I will let everybody know that Bridget had to leave. She had a prior commitment. So Bridget is no longer with us from Newfoundland. But I would like to ask Christine to come back and give us a brief overview of where things are in Nova Scotia. Please go gently on us, Christine, because we are scared.
Well, I mean, Nova Scotia, there were some changes made when we've had a Pay Equity Act like the other provinces here, except Newfoundland, since 1989, so the late 80s, as most other provinces did. However, I think like most of those acts, there's no sanctions for failure to comply. Quebec actually does have penalties, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that we can think that through. Of course, we should be investing and supporting employers to do the right thing. But I'd say that our commission has not been very well resourced to do that. They can intervene to determine matters of dispute. They can direct parties to comply, but it's not a proactive enforcement, as I think we're all wanting to see. There may result like a single wage adjustment, but there's no real ongoing monitoring to keep making sure that that's being followed through. mean, our pay equity legislation does cover public sector and fairly broad, not as broad as PEI is my understanding, but it does cover municipalities and public health institutions and universities, and not just narrow public sector. Newfoundland and Labrador's is super narrow, and in fact doesn't even include contractors. And on pay transparency, the labor code was changed apparently right before the pandemic in Nova Scotia. And it does include some language around transparency, the language where employers are not to seek compensation history from job applicants, though there's some qualification there. And they're not to discipline employees for discussing salaries, but they do not include that employers should be posting job ads with the salaries. So that is a critical part, as Joanne outlined, that will be coming in New Brunswick and is actually part of the labor code in PEI. The change was made in PEI in 2022, which may also be helping over there on some of this front, is that transparency piece, which is definitely showing evidence that it is helping in the provinces that have been making sure that this is happening. And I was just looking at BC's again, and there's definitely some changes there with, I think they said 86% of job ads now have salaries posted. So Nova Scotia has some work to do. There was discussion of a Nova Scotia pay equity legislation that sort of was tabled. I guess it died on the order paper. Maybe somebody else in the room knows what's happened there. So there's some possibility to bring that forward and strengthen that language. But honestly, at the end of the day, we need stronger proactive enforcement, more resources towards the commission and supporting employers to do this, and the private sector. This needs to be applied to the private sector. There really is no reason it should not. So that's, where I know in terms of where Nova Scotia is on this front. I mean, we published recently a report on labor standards in Nova Scotia. I mean, I think we all agree, and I know PEI is just looking at making some small steps forward, some tiny steps on strengthening those minimal standards. They go a long way, right? We know that lifting the bottom lifts women up. And so we continue to do advocacy on strengthening those minimum standards, making that proactively enforced, and also lifting up the minimum wage will help too. So on all those fronts, we still have lots of work to do. We will be releasing a report that focuses on Nova Scotia, but I think would be important in all the provinces, which is around unionization and how do we better facilitate unionization, making it easier. Some provinces have moved forward on making it easier to unionize, and we can see from the data that it makes a difference. And it would make a difference for all who get to have the union advantage. So those are some things that I'll add to that conversation. This was great. It's so great to hear what's happening in the other provinces. And thanks, Joanne, for reminding us that we have to keep our eye on the ball. And of course, what we've learned over the more than 25 years of doing this work is things can roll back too. And so we have to keep fighting because who knows what's around the corner. So thanks all for this intervention. And I think, are going to question and answer. And Melissa has questions too. So thanks.
Yeah, there is a bunch of questions, I believe, in the chat. Christine, do you want to moderate this set part, or do you want me to?
Sure.
Okay.
I can. I see there's a media person in the room. If it's okay, I'm going to ask Vanessa, this is for you. What do you
Yes.
see Maria's question? Are you
Sure.
good to
Yes, the massive pay gap between racialized women and non-racialized men on the island. Can I speak to the impact of that and what it means for those individuals and their families? Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that the impact is huge. PEI is a place that is I love PEI to start. I moved here on purpose. I've lived here for 6 years. And even as a white person moving here, getting a job, figuring out how to navigate this community is very, very challenging. And I think that because because PI has historically not been very diverse and has become increasingly diverse over the years. A lot of those racialized women and racialized folks on the island are immigrants or newcomers. And so that also adds additional stressors and additional difficulties when it comes to dealing with employers, when it comes to pay equity, when it comes to everything really in life. I think that the pay gap, it is harder for racialized women to speak out, for example, to, submit a complaint to the Human Rights Act, to know those channels and to know how things work in the country that we live in, and also how things work on PEI. Those that can, I think, make a huge impact on these families and on, I mean, how much. Something else I was thinking about actually was if you think about someone who bought a house in PI in 2010 and someone who bought a house in PI in 2025, they are paying vastly, vastly different mortgages. And so a lot of times you also have these newcomers and folks who are newer and who are paying they are paying the new high standard of living rates that folks who've lived here for longer are not. And so I think that in addition to seeing that massive pay gap for racialized women and non-racialized men on the island, we're also seeing higher standards of living for racialized women and newcomer women. So I'll start with that.
Got it. Great. Thanks so much, Vanessa. I saw a question earlier that seems to be gone, but was, I think, from somebody who worked in a nonprofit who was talking about the amount of work that in the nonprofit world is often on the shoulders of women to figure out how to actually enact and implement pay equity. I don't know, Joanne, you would know more about this than I would. Yeah, I'll throw it to you if that's okay.
Of course. We are actually working right now with the nonprofit sector, and we've been working with the caregiving sector, which is here mostly for profit, although it also includes not for profit. So we've been looking at pay equity in those workplaces. As you know, those are like the jobs are mostly done by women, but the whole sector is mostly uh, composed of women. So you don't even have a male comparator in the workplace often, which is a challenge in itself. Both Quebec and Ontario have developed ways to do pay equity with comparators outside of workplaces where you have um, no jobs that are mostly done by men. So but that challenge still is doing the job evaluations because all of this is based on job evaluations where you look at responsibilities, working conditions, effort, and qualifications that are required for the jobs. You give points to that, and that's how you figure out what is the value of a job for a workplace. So that takes time and resources. We acknowledge that. So what we've been doing with the caregiving sector is do job evaluations for the whole sector. So for instance, we looked at home support workers and we followed the lead from the government here. They did some voluntary measures a long time ago. We didn't like the methodology. We reworked it and we've evaluated the jobs in some of those sectors by putting them all together for the province because really it's similar workplaces. We're not talking about huge provinces here in the Atlantic. So that reduces the amount of work that employers and employees have to do the job evaluations. You need a few people to make up a committee to do the work, and then you can use those numbers to guide you to find out how much pay equity would be. So that's one way. But one thing that we are asking the government to do is also provide resources to support employers and employees, both. Sometimes they talk about supporting employers only. Well, we need employees to be supported if we want their rights to be recognized. So we are advocating for some training and resources online to help employers and employees to do pay equity once legislation is there. So that would be our answer.
That's great, super helpful. And I've looked at the work that you've done on the evaluation pieces, and it's really important research. So thank you for explaining how we would go forward. We have lots of resources from New Brunswick, so that's great. I see a question there about poverty, in particular about lone mothers or single, yeah. I mean, I'm a co-author of the Child Poverty Report Card here in Nova Scotia, and I support the PEI one being published every year. And it's a real thing. And we talk about pay equity in our report cards. The pay gap is definitely impacting why we see such high poverty rates for lone mothers.
Mhm.
All of the things that we're talking about are impacting lone mothers, right? Not being
Mhm.
able to access childcare, affordable, if not free, really should be free,
Mhm.
but we'll take 10 or less. So the childcare access is critical. The being able to obviously earn fair wages, but being concentrated in low wage jobs, the precarity that comes with that work. I mean, all of that is contributing. And the other thing that we look at in the child poverty report card is that the fact that child poverty is highest for under two. So our little youngest, age 2 and under, and that is because of employment insurance. Right. It is because we've changed that program so much and narrowed the eligibility. So all the things that we talk about have a ripple effect. Women are disproportionately working part-time. That is still the case in PEI. It's just a little bit lower. And that is impacting their ability to have enough hours to even qualify. But we know that more women are working minimum wage than men and in low wages. I mean, under $20 an hour. And what that means is 55% of a low wage is poverty. Doesn't matter how you look at it, it's poverty. And none of our provinces top up on parental and maternity leave at all, right? Quebec does have a provincial top up, which helps. Quebec also has paternity leave to try and get at that initial stage if you're in a heterosexual household and you're making a decision about leave and you think we're not going to ask the person with the higher wage to take cut of 45%, right? And it's not that women shouldn't be able to stay home mothers if they want to. It's that we aren't giving them real options, and we're seeing that in higher poverty rates that are consistently still higher for women for the most part. We're seeing a little bit of shift. More and more men, again, one of the storylines here we're seeing is that some men are not doing as well. But definitely the single parents and the the poverty rates for young children, equity is part of this. And it's just so concerning to see our. So I was doing media. I don't know if any other media is in the room, but media asks questions that get you thinking, right? And that's all really important. Just about how frustrating it must be to continue to work on this. Joanne, as somebody who's so focused on this, yeah, I can only say yes, it is. But asking around, where is the political will? Why isn't it there? We
Mhm.
know where the gaps are. Why have we exempted the private sector?
Mhm. Yep.
Yeah. So sorry, I answered the poverty question and then went on. Melissa, do you have some questions?
You know what? No, I'm just, I'm glad in PEI that the government has kept up with the $10 a day childcare, because we know a lot of provinces haven't, and that would contribute to the child poverty, that does contribute to it. Yeah, I don't have it. This was a lot of information. It truly, truly was. Being new to the role as the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor, I do understand that this happens. Being a racialized woman, I understand it. But then
Mhm.
to see the numbers and hear each of you talk and tell, the information, it was very, very impactful. I think I'm in my feelings right now because I know it happens, but then to see it and hear it, it is it's very impactful. So I thank you all for the great work that you do. I truly do. Do we have Any other questions? I know there's got to be folks out there with questions. So if you do, please put them in the chat.
The one
While
thing,
we're waiting on that, I will say that something with this new provincial budget is that there have been we gave the government a lot of points in our quality report card, which was evaluating through 2025, and there were a lot of cuts to early learning centers. And so that was a disappointing thing to see and something that we'll be advocating for changing. Because the $10 a day childcare is great, but there's so much more that goes into that, as we all know.
yes, and your coverage is still not where it needs to be, right? People, and you have a lot of for-profit, as does New Brunswick. And that is introducing a risk to families. I mean, we're just seeing
The
uh,
loss of of public services is incredibly concerning, and we're seeing that rise across Canada. And we really, really need to protect our public services as much as we can because everyone is going to pay the price when those disappear.
absolutely. I mean, we just
Yeah.
had, I don't know, 1,000 spaces bought by a French from France multinational. Uh,
Ugh.
and so imagine if you were going to your public school and it was sold. Like this should not be happening. So the childcare piece is just so important. There is a new CCPA report that'll be coming out soonish about the state of fees, which
Mm.
also, I
Mhm.
mean, Nova Scotia does not do well on. It's still market-based, but we
Yeah.
are better than we were.
I mean, take what we can get some days to not feel too discouraged, but yeah.
I mean, generational investment in childcare.
Yeah.
Let's applaud that, right? We had not seen it's billions of dollars that have gone into childcare, mostly thanks under the Trudeau government, right? And of course, thanks to all the advocates on the ground who have been advocating. My oldest is 25, definitely been advocating that whole time for affordable childcare. So that is it. What it is a generational investment that we need to keep pushing on. Yeah, Dave, this is the real question, right? Why doesn't government move to address the gap, and who are the interest groups opposing? Well, I mean, how did the private sector get exempted? Let's think about who's in the private sector. We could name some names who have a lot of power in our provinces, right? And those industries in particular, where we see those big pay gaps, lots of power. Right. I mean, we could just do a simple political economic evaluation of power in our provinces, and I guess that's how we are where we're at. The Irvings, the McCains, the oral barons, the private industry who have the ear of government. I mean, I certainly don't have the ear of government. I don't know who does here, but it's not those of us who are working on these issues, at least not right now. Joanne?
Yeah. Well, I know that in the past, over here, the associations representing for the businesses were also certainly not only the big businesses, but also the smaller ones. So it's a lot of yeah, a lot of lobbying that we have to face to move forward for human rights, really, essentially. Mm. But maybe I can give a little positive story
Okay.
because we were hearing from a teaching assistant who had pay equity following our Pay Equity Act in 2009, and she was talking about her experience where she was a lone mother. She had to have a full-time job plus a part-time job. And when she got pay equity in the public sector, then she was able to let go of that second job and was able to spend more time, more quality time with her son. And that was really an experience that she wanted to share with us, with our members. So it's worth fighting when you hear those stories, yes, it does change people's lives and options, and it facilitates women's ability to leave abusive relations as well. So it's really important to continue this work. It's like you were saying, it's small steps and small gains, but we can't stop there. Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think about, what more can we do? Obviously, the evidence is a small part of what's needed to move the needle, and it requires strong advocates to actually use the evidence and bring it forward and continually remind. But I think the other part of, and I do the living wage calculations here, and the evidence around employers who pay the living wage, like I just keep thinking employers are shooting themselves in the foot. We all have very aging populations. We're needing those young workers. We're needing young families to have children here. And well, writ large, our political leaders are missing the boat without investing more in the care economy. But this piece around the living wage, I mean, living wage is something that's been paid in the UK, in the US, and other places for decades. And they've done firm level research that shows that if you pay a living wage, and again, this just seems so common sense, but we now have the evidence, right? Workers are not as stressed out. They don't take as many sick days. They are able to provide even better quality service if you have clients and all of that. And they are more loyal to their employer. They're more likely to stay at their jobs. This decreases the cost for employers because they're not continuing to recruit and retrain. Like it all comes together, and to see, like, I love that story. That's what made me think of it, Joanne, is like it's impacting people's real lives, and employers hear this message. It is impacting your workplace,
Mhm.
and it could be impacting it in a better way if you would just connect the dots more broadly. And I agree. I too hear from CFIB and others whenever the minimum wage goes up, or
Mhm.
that you can't afford it. Well, you can't afford not to do this. One, pay equity. You can't discriminate. It is a human right. Paying a decent wage is just should be the cost of doing business. And if your business model requires you to pay less than that, then we have a problem. And that goes to government too, right? Like we just had a
Mhm.
9-week strike in long-term care. We aren't valuing that work either. And we know that it is critical to all the rest of the economy, as I think Vanessa said. So the evidence is there, and perhaps we can get more and more people to not turn away from it and really realize that actually it's in their best interest too. I don't know. I'm always looking for, like, let's keep pushing and making the case even stronger. I saw a question come in. Civil service pay equity in Nova Scotia. We're working with the Public Service Commission while I came out of previously negotiated. We are making some progress. Some 700 positions have been reclassified as a result. Well, Sandra, I mean, you're welcome to come off mute and speak to this if you'd like. I like to hear.
Sorry, I joined so late. It's certainly an ongoing issue with our reclassification folks and our work with the Public Service Commission. But we've saw some huge reclassifications in the clerical sector, which of course the majority are women or folks not male gendered. And there are a number of other classifications still in that queue. So this work came as a result of negotiated agreements and an arbitration award previous to the most recent one. So we are 4 years into the work. However, we don't have to remind anybody what the state of government is here in Nova Scotia. So getting these things through Treasury Board and across the line is a challenge. But I'm really happy to hear about all of the work around the region with respect to childcare, because it's certainly near and dear to me to see those gains. And to continue the work to push it over the line, because it's more than just reclassifications with respect to everything that help makes life easier for all of our folks. But definitely the work is ongoing with the pay equity, and you would not think today that we still had to do this work, but there is a bit of a commitment on the government side to help get us through, and so I look forward to seeing it. But we're talking 6,000 and more per year difference to some of those salaries. So that's huge benefits to these folks.
Wow.
I don't have to remind you. But anyway, so thanks for all of this. Glad it's recorded. And anyway, thanks for bringing me on, Christine.
Thanks, Sandra. Some don't know, Sandra, president of the Nova Scotia Government General Employees Union, so our public sector union. And I mean, really important that when union leaders and unions are taking this issue on as well. Sandra just reminded me about our government. I mean, the other part of the what this gives you in terms of evidence is around what we're hearing from priorities, certainly from Nova Scotia, and I would argue from the federal government. We did just hear that they put a little more money into childcare to at least sustain what we have. But mostly we're hearing about military and security
Mhm.
and, jobs that are very male dominated, extraction, resources, true of Newfoundland, Labrador, true of Nova Scotia. And our government is cutting what, 3 and 5%, narrow public sector, broader public sector, a lot of nonprofit, a lot of cuts coming, and that will disproportionately harm women. And here you have more evidence, both of, if a government's economic priorities do not include the care economy, you are missing the boat entirely, but you are definitely not providing equitable opportunities for women. And if you are cutting public sector jobs, you are disproportionately harming women, because that's where, not only is that where we find more women, but we find more women in higher paying jobs. So that will impact this pay gap. So I think, this evidence is to support the advocacy on the ground that's pushing on both the provincial government and the federal government to really think through what their priorities here. Federal government is supposed to be doing a gender-based analysis of their budget, but they apparently, the last time I looked at it, they argued that the military was entirely equitable because we all benefit from it as community safety. So their gender-based analysis is not exactly what we would do as feminists on the ground to really look at what that means, right? When that's divorced from what are you trying to achieve. But I think the evidence that we're showing you here today can also push just on government priorities, right? And understanding who benefits and who's paying the costs of some of those decisions that are coming out of government. The same is true of tax cuts and, all of that. So were there questions? More questions? Oh, Ruby's put in our last report on childcare. Would not take on a female apprentice due to concerns of how this may affect male work. Oh, his male workers' productivity. Ugh. And what the heck can we do about that, eh? Like, sorry. I don't know. Is that Isa who shared that?
Yes.
So
Yeah, you're welcome to
I,
that.
I just wanted to share that just because I found that to be an extremely frustrating conversation, because how do you counter that? How do you, because it is prevalent, unfortunately, in lots of areas, but I mean, this is the area that I work and live. So it's pretty frustrating to hear that, and being concerned about the workers not being able to do their jobs day to day because they might be concerned about what might happen to her if it, yeah. So, and this is an area where higher earnings a lot of the times come from trades work. So that directly impacts, whether women can gain work in the area, in the field. And so just want to share that. Thank you.
Yes, well, I think I thank you. Yes, no, seriously. I mean, I know that there's work happening in this province. Actually, I think all the provinces are doing work to try and support women entering into trades, and what we need to be doing around working conditions in the trades to make them more inclusive and We still have lots of work to do, obviously, in that area to really
Mm.
make it possible. I know I sought out a woman plumber. We probably still only have a few, I don't know. And she told me she had her own company because that's what you do when you have the first opportunity. But she said she had to do a completely unpaid apprenticeship because she could not find
Oh.
a paid placement. And you know, she had the stories of like how many women appreciate having a woman plumber, right? You're opening your
Mhm.
house, you're inviting somebody into your home. We all can understand. And if you're a woman alone, that alone, but also like my experience with her as a trade, as an anecdote, right? The way she explained things, the way that like I understood what she was doing and why she was charging me what, like yeah, she's like, I have a lot of return. I can't even get a hold of her anymore. So she's super busy. I think, I hope she's still even in the job. Who knows? Because it's very difficult. So much more work that needs to be done there. I know we have a couple organizations here that are definitely doing work in that area. And
I think, uh,
yeah, go
if,
ahead.
yeah, I think we also need employment equity legislation that is, really solid, so that it would benefit women, but again, all equity-seeking groups in our provinces. Again, legislation is not enough. It's important to have the training, to have the support, but I think legislation gives a strong message that this is a form of discrimination that's not going to be tolerated anymore.
I will say that the Women's Network of PEI has a fabulous program called Trade Horizons. And so it's kind of like a college exploration program for women and gender diverse folks that focuses on exploring trades and technology careers. So it is actually an opportunity to directly bring women into traditionally male-dominated fields of work. So that's been, I mean, as far as I know, an extremely successful program, and I hear a lot of great things about it. So there are good things happening in terms of that, but there are still, of course, some unfortunate views, uh, as as we've discussed. Yeah.
Yes, I can't think of the Nova Scotia program. I don't know if anybody in the chat can remember. It's gone from my head, but we have a similar program
Mhm.
here as well that is supporting. And I know there's been like focus groups and work with men who are in trades to
Mhm.
kind of do that education work and you know what this means, supporting them.
Yeah.
I don't have patience for that. I'm going to stay over here in my office doing my research, but I so appreciate that some people are doing that really important work.
Mhm.
Just saying. Okay. I think we maybe are coming to the end, huh? Oh, and I do welcome anybody who wants to share anything else to come off mute or show their camera or whatever, because I like to see community. So before we sign off, thanks everyone for joining. Oh, Leanne, yes. So in terms of procurement, it is one of our recommendations in our report is around government's leadership on exactly that procurement. Our one
Mhm.
example is the Halifax Regional Municipality did incorporate the living wage into procurement, into contracts. So any contract with the city, a contractor is supposed to pay, and I will say is supposed to pay all of their employees who are working in that contract a living wage. And we definitely know that some are following through on that. It is a requirement of when they put out their RFP. So part of the bid is you can't underbid somebody. You all have to pay a living wage. So that is important. And it
Mhm.
should be where our governments are leading on because that's billions of dollars a year in procurement that government, I mean, ultimately, we shouldn't be contracting out so much, but that's a whole other, as Vanessa said. But we do have that here. And we know when that came in what was it? What was it? 2019? That we had workers that saw significant increases in their wages, right? These were, wait, that wasn't her question. Oh, that question. So, in terms of living wage certification, I will just finish on the HRM. So, there is an example. We haven't seen any other municipality move forward. There are definitely municipalities across the country and definitely employers across the country. And you are correct. Many other provinces have employer certification programs. We do not have any in Atlantic Canada. There is a conversation right now nationally to figure out a national certification program that uses the local living wage calculations. And I'm hoping that actually moves forward because we do want to recognize, I hear from employers who are paying a living wage. The ones that reach out to me, there's likely others. It's you have to, from the get-go, have that in your business model, right? And so we would love to recognize them and have that kind of program across the region. And there are conversations. This has been on my hope list for a long time that we haven't been able to move forward, but I'm actually hoping that there'll be some momentum because Ontario's had a program for a very long time, very developed program, as has BC, and so there's Living Wage Canada is formalizing and is looking at certification. There's now an international methodology and certification happening. The ILO is looking at this work and the OECD. So it's a really great time to move this forward. And what I love about that, and you can all appreciate, is that in Ontario there was a an organization of employers who are paying a living wage that formed, and they now have a broader organization, and I can't think of their name. They are looking to become more national. And what's super valuable about that is, first and foremost, they pay a living wage, but they are called on to speak to media. Media can call on them when the minimum wage goes up, when there's some conversation about, you get a different voice. You get a voice from employers who are not only paying minimum, they're paying living, and they can talk about that experience. And boy, do we need a more diversity of employer business voices to be talking about what it means to be a good employer and what it means to follow through on some of this. Hey, so sorry, that was a whole tangent of things. But yes, we should remember there are some things that we've done that are moving some of these needles, right? Melissa, you're going to move some needles.
I'm gonna try, but I just want to say, with some help from you, I will be calling you very soon. I just want to say thank you for all the work that each and every one of you do. Wonderful, wonderful work. And thank you for having me here to moderate your discussion today. It was very informative. The information that I got was valuable, and I appreciate each and every one of you. So thank you.